My name is Brian Fuchs, and I'm a climatologist at the National Drought Mitigation Center, and we're housed within the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm going to be the leader today for the webinar. So with the first slide, just some information on these calls. There's many groups collaborating to put these on each month, and they're recognized here at the top. The next call is going to be held on January 16th of next year. Again, these are typically held on the third Thursday of each month, so that's the schedule that we've been following. Past webinars can also be found at either one of the two links that are given below. And also to sign up for these webinars, there's a link here at the bottom of that slide to do so if you'd like to sign up for any of the future webinars. And again, if there's any questions on doing this, we can address those at the end or speak with John Ice. So a quick agenda of what I'm going to go over today. I'm going to briefly speak on the current conditions and what's been happening up to this point in 2013. A few slides on some of the agricultural updates that I can give for this time of the year. Briefly have some regional impacts of what's been going on in the region, some of the outlooks, and then at the very end we will have some time for questions and comments. So to dig right in, the last full month of data that we do have is from November, and looking at the statewide rankings, the temperatures on the left and precipitation on the right. The one thing that really stood out to me was the temperatures on the left, and you can see that most states were east of the Missouri River were at or below normal for temperatures in November. And if you look further to the west, you see that the high plains and into the Rockies, they were right at near normal. But then again, out west, we see quite a few areas that were above normal, as well as in Florida. And also looking at the precipitation in November, we did see some pretty good precipitation in parts of the upper Midwest, parts of Michigan into Wisconsin, but a lot of areas were right at normal to below normal. Typically, November for the Midwest and Plains is not a very wet time of year, so this is as expected. When you do see some of these deficits in November, it's not contributing to the overall deficit or surplus either way very much. Looking at the precipitation, you can see that up in Michigan, out of 119 years, this was one of the wettest Novembers that they've had up there. And in contrast, you look at Wyoming, quite a bit below normal, almost top 10 driest November on a statewide basis for November as well. So looking at the calendar year to date, again, temperatures on the left and precipitation on the right, again, we've seen that cool signal, and that's in stark contrast to what we saw in 2012, where it was a very warm year through much of the Midwest and Plains. And here all the way from the Midwest down into the Southeast, seeing from January through November, fairly cool rankings for that time frame. And again, the further west you go, it's the flip side. You get across the Rockies and California standing there with top 10 warmest year on record so far. And then we look at the precipitation from January through November on the right-hand side. And again, stark contrast to 2012, where we did see some of those precipitation values respond and rebound from how dry we were in 2012. And looking at a few states that are checking in with one of the wettest years, or the wettest year on record, when you look at both Michigan and North Dakota. And South Dakota and Wisconsin aren't too far behind with a top 10 wettest year. And then your eyes really shift out to the West Coast, and you can see what's going on in California and Oregon and Idaho and Nevada, where, again, this has been another dry year through that area. And one area I did want to point out was if you look in the Southeast, we have places like Georgia and South Carolina and into Tennessee with one of the wettest years on record, but really have to take into account when some of that precipitation was seen, because lately it has been dry in that area, and we'll touch on that as I go into some of the drought products further on. So it's just interesting how statistics can tell a story, but maybe not the full story. So some significant events that took place so far in November and in the autumn of 2013 coming from the National Climatic Data Center. I highlighted the two that really were important in our region, and the first one was the tornado outbreak that took place in November, and there was significant damage in several areas of the Midwest, and even some fatalities in Illinois, and this was quite the outbreak of tornadoes, not only just the tornadoes, but fairly strong and significant tornadoes. And then the other one that I've highlighted has been the Rocky Mountains and Northern Plains, how wet it was in the autumn with improving drought conditions through the upper Rockies and into parts of the high plains where I mentioned some of the top 10 wet seasons are taking place. And this has done a lot as far as sending water into some of the main stem waterways in that area, as well as replenishing some soil moisture conditions that were quite depleted or just kind of carrying on from the drought of 2012. So some positives in our area as far as some of the moisture, but also that severe weather we always want to take into account and making sure people are safe with their plans to respond when there is severe weather, especially in times of the year when you're not expecting it the most. So the first thing I'm going to really concentrate on here is the precipitation year to date. And this is the percent of normal product that's showing kind of the contrast to the region from the headwaters of the Missouri up in Montana and North Dakota and through South Dakota. You can really see that so far this year, anywhere from 150 up to 200% of normal, even some areas above that for precipitation. So again, quite the wet year in parts of the region. And then as you go further to the south and east, you can see that dryness in Iowa, northern Missouri, parts of southwest and southwest Nebraska, western Kansas, eastern Colorado, really was the area that did not see full response to the precipitation from the drought of 2012, but also the area that it seemed like we had some precipitation early and then it did dry out. And there's spots of dryness through the Midwest as well in Illinois and Indiana and even up in parts of northern Minnesota where some of these areas, it seems like their neighbors picked up the precipitation, but for many reasons, some of these areas just did not. But looking at the comparison again to 2012, even getting 70% of normal after the dryness it was last year was better, but did not improve the overall situation for some of these areas. The departures from normal here on this product is showing that in those wet areas anywhere from a foot to 16 inches of excess moisture from normal so far for the last 12 months. And then through parts of the Central Plains, we see those deficits of 4, maybe 8 inches, approaching 10 to 12, and in some of those areas that did not pick up that rain. And then you look in the upper Midwest in Michigan, parts of Wisconsin, and again you see those surpluses. And then as you go further to the southeast, you do see that many of those states were working on near record highs for precipitation for the last 12 months. So over the last 30 days in the region, we can see that it has been dry. There's a very sharp gradient of precipitation that starts in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and to the south and east of that area. We have seen quite a bit of moisture over the last 30 days. But for the most part, much of the central and high plains has been fairly dry, very little in the amount of snow. And even with the snow that has fallen, much of that has been dry. And that is in response to the cold air in the region, too. That air just does not have the ability to hold a lot of moisture. Looking at the percent of normal over the last 30 days, again, this is typically a fairly dry time of year, and so those deficits don't develop too quickly, but you can see those that have and those that have not had precipitation here in the last month. And just over the last 2 weeks, looking at precipitation and temperatures, percent of normal precipitation, again, through the Dakotas and the upper Midwest into Montana, fairly decent precipitation here in the last couple of weeks. There's been a couple of good systems move through that area. But then again, you get into parts of Nebraska and Kansas through Iowa and Illinois. And it has stayed dry over the last couple of weeks. And temperatures, this is what we've been seeing through most of the late autumn and the first part of winter here in December, was temperatures have definitely been cool. Almost the entire region has been below normal over not only the last couple weeks, but the last month or so. Even with a slight warm up here this week in some of the area, temperatures definitely, looking in the Dakotas, 20 degrees below normal for the last couple weeks, and that's been fairly consistent here for the last month or so. Looking to our neighbors to the west, looking at the snow water equivalent for the snow-tell sites, we can see that in areas of Montana and Wyoming and into Colorado, some pretty good early snow so far, especially at those upper elevation sites where last year at this time we were not seeing that early snow, and we really had some concerns going into winter of what that would mean coming into spring. So right now with the combination of the moisture in the fall really helping saturate some of those soils in Montana, Wyoming, and parts of Colorado, and then the good early season snows on top of that is giving people a little more positive attitude as far as what the potential for runoff will be in the spring if this continues. But you don't have to go too far to see a different story, and over the western U.S. It is getting quite dire that this has been multiple years now where we've had dryness, and then this year has started off fairly slow as far as snow measurements up in those upper elevation stations. So you can see through Oregon into Nevada and even up into Washington, they're quite a bit behind the curve for this time of year already as far as how much moisture they're holding and what snowpack they do have. So something to watch as we move forward. And again, the NRCS out in Portland, they do regular updates of these data, and we watch them quite closely as we move forward through the winter. I've brought up soil moisture a couple different times already, and this is something that we do look at quite a bit as we are in growing seasons and even outside of growing seasons, and there's a lot of reasons to look at this. I mentioned runoff potential, but also we're looking at how effectively the soils can freeze in the wintertime, especially for the most northern climates of the United States, and also how much moisture you're going to be holding in those soils as they do freeze, and it really gives us an idea of what to expect in the spring. Again, the real wild card in this is going to be how much snow we do see this winter and how much of that is sitting on top of a frozen snowpack. As we can see, this is a modeled product from the NLDAS system of the total column of soil moisture in a percentile. And we can still see that there are some areas in the Midwest and into the southern plains that are still showing some deficits of soil moisture in the full column. With that being said, most of those areas did see some pretty decent recharge here in the fall in that top foot to foot and a half of soil, and that did start to freeze up here. So going forward, it seems like we're really talking about regenerating more of that deeper soil moisture. We're not going to do that here in the winter. It's really going to have to be something that is going to be addressed in the spring, but that frozen soil and then snow during the winter months will really dictate what we can expect in the spring. Now, looking at the northern plains and into parts of Montana, you can really see those surpluses. So what does that mean for basins such as the Missouri or the Platte going through Nebraska is that with that soil being saturated here in the winter, freezing up, any of that snow that we do see over the winter months will have a good potential of running off and getting into the rivers and streams and going downstream, filling up some of those reservoirs and lakes along the way. So that is a positive that we have seen since this fall. And even though those flooding rains that we saw out in Colorado earlier in the fall, and the push of water that went through the South Platte Basin, it did a very good job of scouring that riverbed in a way that we typically don't get to see too much in a natural setting, and is going to do a lot of good for the Platte riverbed going through much of Nebraska. So then we get to the drought monitor, and this is today's release of the product. And you can see that right now we have about 31.5% of the CONUS in drought right now. And some of these areas that we're looking at, especially where they're designated with that L signal from Nebraska and central to western Kansas into Texas, we're seeing those were the areas that even with some of the recovery that we saw in 2013 from the drought of 2012, there is still some problems in those areas, and they're still hanging on quite aggressively with the dryness in those regions. Now, looking at some of those areas in Illinois and Iowa and northern Missouri up into Minnesota and western Wisconsin, some of those areas did see some pretty decent rains towards the end of summer and the first part of fall, and it did start to improve some of the drought intensity in those areas, but we're still looking at this going into winter. And typically we don't see a lot of changes in these areas as far as their drought status as we go into the winter months, because it's just too many of the winter impacts in play. Down in the southern plains of Oklahoma, Texas, into New Mexico, this drought that started back in the fall of 2010 is still hanging on, even with some of the improvements in those regions. A lot of water suppliers are really looking at what they have in store going into this next year with the ongoing multi-year drought out there. And then out in the western U.S., we can see, again, those problems in California and Oregon into Nevada. And again, almost the same situation there. A third dry year in those regions will really start to diminish some of the mitigation techniques that the water managers and water suppliers can do out there. So they're really hoping that the dryness they've seen early this snow season will turn around for them, and we don't see many more of those problems develop. Looking at the central region here, again, with today's release, we have just a little under 11% of the region in drought. The only D4 drought that we see is hanging on in southeast Colorado. And for the most part, there's not even a lot of severe drought, only about a little under 6% of the region. So the drought has diminished from the start of the calendar year. We were at 15.5%, so we're down right at 5% so far. And a year ago we were at 15.62, which was almost the same map that we saw at the calendar year. Just 3 months ago, though, we were at 22.9% of the region, so we've cut that in half in about the last 3 months, and that really does show that the moisture that we did pick up here in the fall, that did go to some of that soil moisture recharge and some of the recharge of the rivers and streams and reservoirs and lakes in the region. It did start impacting the drought in a positive way in this region, so that was good to see. Now with some of the ag impacts, this time of year we don't have a lot of agriculture going on, but we do look at winter wheat. And I'm going to thank the folks at the World Ag Outlook Board for providing these updates each week when the drought monitor comes out. And with that being said, we have about a third of the winter wheat grown in the U.S. in drought right now. And you can see those areas in the dark green are the main areas, and the light green are the minor winter wheat growing areas. And you can see where that's being impacted mostly through Nebraska and Kansas into Oklahoma and Texas. But we also see some of that western wheat region being impacted as well. Looking at the trend, we can see that for the most part since about September, the drought impacting the winter wheat areas has declined, but a little uptick here over the last couple weeks, especially with some of those western areas. The hay areas right now, we're right at 22% of the domestic hay acres impacting, being impacted by drought. Again, these are going to be your cattle producing areas. So really looking at, especially down in Texas and Oklahoma and parts of Kansas and Colorado, some of those areas that have really been hampered over the last couple of years. Again, there are still some hay shortages in those areas, and again, it's nice to see this number declining over time. And again, I mentioned the cattle areas, a little over a third of the domestic cattle regions are in drought right now. And again, some of the same areas from Nebraska and Kansas down into Texas and Oklahoma, as well as some of those areas in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The western neighbors are doing a little bit better, but again, this next year of potential dryness in the region does have some people on edge as far as not only water for irrigation on hay fields, but also water for animals and what they may have to do to counteract some of those problems. Some of the regional climatic impacts for the region, looking at the Missouri River Basin, and these points came from Kevin Lau. Right now, I mentioned the above normal soil moisture in the upper basin has likely allowed for soils to freeze and could enhance spring runoff potential. And I think that's important because even last year, as some of those areas were right at normal to slightly above normal with some late snows, the runoff potential was really reduced with the dry soils that we had in the region. So I think that's a positive going into 2014. With that being said, with the abundance of water in some of those areas as well as the early cold weather in those areas, we have had some early ice jams on several of the rivers along the Missouri Basin. And again, with that cold weather setting in and staying in the region for the most part, this has caused some early ice jams, but not too many problems associated with that. And also for some of the power plants in the region, there has been some talk of how the water going into ice as early as it did has hampered some of the water intakes on power plants, and this was pointed out as an example that has taken place on the Yellowstone River. Just not enough water to go into those intakes for the power plants right now. Looking at the river storage in the Missouri River Basin, and right now there's 50.1 million acre feet in storage, which is slightly below, and we can see the different levels of storage. Looking at the next slide, we can see the 2013-2014 water year in the dark blue and see how it compares to the 81 to 2010 average. Looking at the maximum in 1997 and the minimum of 2001, we can see just where we're at above Fort Peck and then between Fort Peck and Garrison as far as where we should be for this time of year. And again, I mentioned the cold through the region. I went to some of the state climatologist websites in the region and just saw what they were saying about the cold weather so far this year, and I used Missouri, Minnesota, and Iowa as in my examples. I really like the chart that Pat Ganan had in Missouri showing that since January of 2013, we've only had, in Missouri now, there's only been 3 months that have been above average compared to the long-term average. All the rest have been below. And again, if everyone remembers what we went through in 2012, every single one of those months was above normal in 2012. So quite the change from one year to the next. And we can see also in Minnesota, looking at the November departures, and also in Iowa, the departures anywhere, and looks like Iowa was right at 3 degrees below normal for the month of November across the state. And Minnesota not as bad, but about a degree below normal, but some of the districts were significantly different. So again, coldness through the region, and anyone who's in the region, I probably don't have to tell you that, you've been experiencing it, but there are some impacts due to that cold weather that we have seen so far. Now going into the outlook right now, the first thing we're looking at here in the upper right is the 5-day temperature outlook, and in the lower left, the 7-day precipitation outlook. Again, cold weather through the region, anywhere from 6 to 12 degrees below normal through much of the central and high plains into the upper Midwest. It looks like there's a delineation line that's going through parts of Michigan, through Illinois and down into Kansas. We're right along that area near normal temperatures, and then if you're out in front of that, those warm temperatures that some of the plains and Midwest have seen the last couple days are going to continue as the storm system moves to the east. Along with that, down in the lower left, you can see the potential for precipitation through the region. I think in Illinois, Ohio, southern Illinois into southern Missouri, northern Arkansas. Seems like those are the areas that over the next 7 days are looking at the greatest potential for precipitation, and I have seen some flood watch products coming out from the Weather Service in some of those same areas to go along with this precipitation forecast. And again, you look out to the western U.S., it seems like in the Pacific Northwest, the further south you go into central Oregon and northern California, those areas just are not seeing that precipitation. So again, that precipitation forecast is over the next 7 days and does take us through Christmas Day on the 25th. The 8 to 14 day outlook, I have temperatures on the upper right and precipitation on the lower left, and we'll start with precipitation probabilities. It does look like that the potential for below normal precipitation is quite the the continuing factor across much of the United States. The highest odds of below normal precipitation, again, are out on the west coast, but it seems like unless you're in New England or along the eastern seaboard, your chances for normal to above normal precipitation are quite low, and it looks like that's been fairly consistent with several model runs. Now, looking at temperatures, again, that cold weather is going to continue. It seems like much of the country outside of the west coast in Alaska and Florida is seeing very high potential for below normal precipitation, and this takes us all the way through January 1st. So if you're looking at where your favorite bowl game is going to be, is it going to be warm and dry? It looks like the potential, if you're out in California or the Southwest or in Florida, it looks like that is going to be the case. So we can all root for our football teams wherever they're going to be. The update of the ENSO predictions from the IRI CPC group and all the different model runs they're looking. The bright yellow line is the median of all the different models. So it does look like, through the end of winter, we're going to be very neutral again to maybe trending towards spring and early summer to an El Nino, not an El Nino, but a warmer signal approaching what we would need for maybe El Nino development. But again, not a lot to go on with that, as the neutral conditions that we have been experiencing are going to continue through the winter into the first part of spring at least, if not further on. The seasonal drought outlook from CPC was updated today and released with the drought monitor. For our region of the Midwest and Plains, not a lot of change. Again, the winter time is really not a lot. It's not a time that we see a lot of movement for drought through this region. Again, through central Illinois and into parts of Missouri, with that QPF that is anticipated here over the next couple of days, there are some chances for improvement in those areas. We do continue to see that dryness in the southeast developing, and if you go back and remember what I said on one of my first slides, a lot of those states are going into top 10 record wet years. Georgia, South Carolina, into North Carolina, and we're anticipating drought developing again. So it just really shows you how quickly some of the regions can change, and also you need to take into account when you look at any of these statistics, when did that rain fall, and what has happened since those rains have fallen. Through the west, we're seeing a lot of that drought continuing to persist and even developing in the southwest and into the central Rockies during this time. That's going to be something to really watch. Maybe the northern Rockies in that area of Idaho and Montana are seeing some removal or improvements. Again, the storm track seems to be going on a more northerly basis right now, and so that would make sense. The monthly drought outlook was released at the end of November for the month of December. Again, you can see some of the changes from the seasonal, especially that area in Illinois, persistence through the rest of the region, as we had talked about. And back at the end of November, that development in the southeast really wasn't as strong as what we're seeing now with the seasonal that came out today. So again, you can see how things have changed over the last 3 weeks or so with response to the different models that we're looking at when these drought outlooks are coming out. So in a quick summary, most of the region will record a wetter than normal year in 2013 in contrast to 2012. Normal to cooler than normal temperatures dominated the region this last year. Again, this was in stark contrast to 2012. And decent recharge of the soil moisture, especially in the top 18 inches or so of the profile, helped to ease drought in the region. And that's something we're going to have to really look at going into spring. Not only what that recharge actually was, but also how much snow is going to be sitting on top of those frozen soils as we do start thawing out and approaching spring-like conditions. So with that being said, there's some information again on some of the contributing partners and where to get some of these products that I highlighted today on this slide here, and then I will open that up for any questions at this time. Well, I must have did a good job of covering everything if no one has a question for me.
Sure sounds like it. Well, very good. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we wish you a safe, sane, and sober holiday season coming up. And we'll see you next month, and that will be on January 16th. Thank you, and goodbye.